So this is a question from Adrian in Bristol. Why are we not allowed to negotiate any trade deals at the moment? I would have thought stopping us from doing this was illegal.
Okay, good question. So this is what is known as the EU's Common External Trade Policy, or sometimes the EU's commercial policy. The basic idea is that all the EU countries have signed up to having a joint trade policy. So instead of setting our own tariffs individually and doing our own trade negotiations, the EU does that as a bloc, right? So it's not that the UK can't negotiate trade agreements, but it can only do it through the EU. So, I mean, just this year, the EU has concluded agreements with Japan and with Singapore, which, if the UK remained in the EU, would apply to the UK in future. But we can't go out there and do it on our own while we're part of the EU. The idea of doing everything together is that, as I said before, power in trade negotiations comes from size. So by clubbing together all the small countries in the EU, it gives you more power than the UK would have on its own. But it does give you less flexibility to tailor negotiations to the needs of each individual country.
Interesting. I think that that's one that is actually sort of how the process is going to work as we go into the next year even. Do you think sort of when does that stop come in where actually we would then be able to go and do that independently? Or will that also depend on what the deal is?
It depends on what the deal is. The way the withdrawal agreement is worded at the moment, we would be allowed to start negotiating new deals during the transition, so after March 2019.
Okay.
But they couldn't come into force until the transition ends. Excuse me. That said, the Irish backstop that's currently in the withdrawal agreement essentially keeps the UK in a customs union with the EU. And, if that's what ends up being implemented, if we're in a customs union, we can't really do our own trade deals, at least for goods trade. We can't negotiate over our own tariffs. So if we do end up in that kind of customs agreement, in a customs union, our scope for an independent trade policy would be very limited, even kind of 10 or 15 years down the road. So it very much depends on what the deal eventually looks like.
Could you tell us a little bit more about that backstop agreement and what that means? We asked this question in the first Facebook Live we did, but for any new audience members, could you tell us a little bit more about what that is?
Yeah, I mean, so it's in there to ensure that there doesn't have to be a hard border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. And the idea in the withdrawal agreement at the moment is the way that Irish border will be avoided is through kind of two things. One is that the UK and the EU will remain in a customs union, right? And that means you don't need customs checks on the Irish border. The second part is that Northern Ireland, but not the rest of the UK, just Northern Ireland, is going to stay in the single market, which means essentially it keeps the same regulations as the rest of the EU. So you don't have to worry about kind of regulatory checks on the Irish border. Now, this only kind of happens if the UK and the EU can't reach another deal that avoids the Irish border. But it is a backstop. If another type of deal isn't reached, and it's not obvious what other deal would be reached, this is what kicks in. Right? So, one possibility is certainly that this backstop becomes the basis for the long-term relationship, right? And if that's the case, it means we're staying in the customs union long-term.